The year was 1974, and the official story was that Apollo 17 had been the final manned mission to the moon. The public celebrated its triumphs and quietly moved on, their attention drawn to earthbound crises. But deep within the halls of NASA, a different story was unfolding, a story of secrecy, fear, and the unknown. Apollo 19, a classified mission to the far side of the moon, was about to launch under the veil of national security. Commander Jack Sullivan sat quietly in the command module of the towering Saturn V rocket, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his helmet. At 52, he was the oldest astronaut on the roster, a steady hand known for keeping his cool under pressure. Beside him, Dr. Evelyn Harper checked the readings on her wrist telemetry monitor, her sharp green eyes reflecting the glow of the instrument panel. Evelyn's reputation as a brilliant exobiologist had earned her a spot on this covert crew, though the details of her assignment were deliberately vague. Lunar Module pilot Mark Dawson, the team's engineer, adjusted his harness and shot a grin at Jake Turner, the youngest and most inexperienced of the group. Jake gave a nervous laugh, his hands gripping the armrests a little too tightly. "You ever seen anything like this, Jake?" Mark teased, nodding toward the tiny porthole-shaped window. Outside, the vastness of space loomed, swallowing the spacecraft in its black, infinite maw. "Can't say I have," Jake admitted, "but I always figured the moon wouldn't look so hostile." The far side of the moon came into view as the rocket broke free of Earth's gravitational pull. Unlike the familiar cratered face visible from Earth, the far side seemed jagged, its surface carved by unrelenting impacts. It looked ancient, untouched by time, yet strangely alive in the way shadows danced across its surface. "Stay focused, everyone," Jack said, his voice steady. "This is what we signed up for." The mission's official briefing had been concise: geological survey, sample collection, reconnaissance. But in the quiet corners of the pre-launch meetings, Jack had been handed a sealed file containing fragmented transmissions, static-laden signals captured by unmanned probes on the moon's far side. The patterns were irregular, almost organic. No one dared call them alien, not yet, but the ambiguity lingered in the air like a bad omen. The Saturn V roared to life, each stage separating with clockwork precision. Hours turned into days as the crew settled into their routines, monitoring systems, practicing maneuvers, and preparing for the descent. The camaraderie among the four astronauts helped mask the unease gnawing at their minds. Evelyn, ever the scientist, was the most vocal about her excitement, marveling at the opportunity to study untouched lunar geology. Mark kept things light with his jokes, while Jake quietly absorbed everything around him, trying not to show his inexperience. Only Jack remained outwardly indifferent, his focus locked on the mission. As Apollo 19 slipped into orbit around the moon's far side, communication with mission control ceased, as expected. Yet the silence felt heavier than it should have, as though the moon itself were muffling their presence. The crew's conversations grew quieter, their words clipped, their movements more deliberate. The dark side of the moon loomed below, its deep craters and jagged mountains bathed in cold shadows. When it was time to descend, Jack and Mark piloted the Luna Hawk lander toward a vast, unnamed crater, its rim taller than any mountain on Earth. Evelyn and Jake watched from their seats, awestruck by the sheer scale of it. The ground came into focus, uneven, fractured, littered with boulders larger than their spacecraft. "Touchdown in 5, Jack announced, his voice cutting through the tension. The lander shuddered as its legs made contact with the surface. The dust swirled briefly in the weak lunar gravity before settling. "Luna Hawk has landed," Mark said, his grin audible even through his comms. "Looks like we've got ourselves a new home away from home." The crew donned their suits, their helmets sealing with a sharp hiss. As the hatch opened, they stepped out into a world devoid of sound and color, where shadows stretched unnaturally long. Evelyn's boots left the first prints in the soft, powdery regolith, and she knelt to collect a sample. She gasped. "Commander," she said, holding up a chunk of rock. Embedded within it were faint, shimmering threads like veins of an iridescent material. "I've never seen anything like this. It's beautiful." Jack crouched beside her, his gloved hand brushing the surface of another rock. The threads seemed to pulse faintly under the harsh beam of his helmet light. "Let's bag it and get back inside," he said. "We'll analyze it further once we're secure." The first day passed uneventfully, though tension simmered just below the surface. Mark conducted repairs on the lander, while Evelyn cataloged samples, her enthusiasm bubbling over in bursts of scientific jargon. Jack monitored the systems, his brow furrowed as he scanned the readouts. Jake, tasked with logging their activities, began to notice something strange. The equipment wasn't functioning as expected. Battery life drained faster than it should. Instruments calibrated themselves without input. Then came the static. It started faint, barely audible, but persistent. Evelyn was the first to notice it during her analysis. A low, rhythmic hum played through her headset, a pattern that made her chest tighten. She called Jack over, her voice trembling. "It's coming from the rocks," she said. Jack leaned closer, listening to the faint sound. It was unlike anything he'd heard, mechanical yet organic, as if the moon itself were breathing. He stood abruptly. "Everyone inside," he ordered. "Now!" As the crew retreated to the lander, the static grew louder, drowning out their comms. The far side of the moon, once so lifeless, now seemed to watch them with unseen eyes. And as the lander door sealed, cutting off the silence of the lunar surface, they realized something chilling. Their link to mission control was gone. The silence was absolute, oppressive. Inside the sealed lander, the crew stared at the lifeless comms panel, the green signal light extinguished. For all their training, none of them had prepared for this, a complete and sudden loss of contact with Earth. The dark side of the moon loomed beyond the small portholes, its jagged craters lit only by the sterile glow of the lander's exterior lights. The team's isolation was no longer theoretical. It was real and suffocating. "We need to figure out what's causing this," Jack Sullivan said, his voice steady but tight. "Mark, check the external antenna array. Evelyn, see if there's any interference coming from the samples." Mark nodded, slipping into his seat at the engineering console. His fingers flew across the controls, scanning the systems. "The array's intact," he said after a moment. "No physical damage, no signal obstruction. This doesn't make any sense." "It's the rocks," Evelyn said, her tone eerily calm. She had removed her helmet and was hunched over a tray of samples, her headlamp illuminating the strange, shimmering threads embedded in the lunar regolith. There's some kind of signal coming from them. Low frequency, repetitive, almost biological. Jack frowned. Biological? Evelyn didn't look up. She was too focused on the tiny filaments visible under her portable microscope. They pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if responding to her presence. "I can't explain it," she said. "But whatever this is, it's not natural. These threads are organic, part of a living system." Jake Turner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You're saying the rocks are alive?" His voice cracked on the last word, betraying his unease. "No," Evelyn said, "not the rocks, but something inside them is, and it's broadcasting." A chill settled over the cabin. Jack ran a hand over his face, the weight of command pressing down on him like the gravity they'd left behind. "All right," he said. "We need more data. Evelyn, you keep working on the samples. Mark, run diagnostics on every system. Jake and I will scout the immediate area, see if there's anything nearby that might be interfering with our comms." Jake hesitated but didn't argue. The hatch opened with a hiss, and the two men stepped onto the surface, their boots crunching softly against the powdery regolith. The harsh beams of their helmet lights cut through the darkness, revealing a landscape that seemed more alien with every step. Shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing details in their inky depths. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake muttered as they approached the edge of a nearby ridge. Jack ignored him, focusing on the terrain ahead. He stopped suddenly, his breath catching. "Look at this," he said, kneeling. Jake stepped closer, his stomach twisting as he saw what Jack was pointing at. The ground was scarred with long, jagged lines, as if something had been dragged across the surface. The grooves were too deep and precise to be natural. "What could have done that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack stood, scanning the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we're going to find out." They followed the grooves for several meters until they reached the entrance to a cavern. Its mouth yawned open, jagged and irregular, like the maw of some primordial creature. Jack knelt again, examining the edges of the opening. The same shimmering threads from the rocks lined the entrance, faintly glowing under the beams of their lights. "This is where it's coming from," Jack said. "Coming from what?" Jake asked, his voice rising. "We don't even know what this is. Shouldn't we head back and—" A faint sound interrupted him, a low, rhythmic hum emanating from deep within the cavern. It was the same pattern Evelyn had described, but louder, almost melodic. It seemed to vibrate through their suits, resonating in their bones. Jake took a step back. "Jack, I don't like this. We should—" A sharp crack echoed behind them. Both men spun around, their lights illuminating a cloud of dust rising from the ridge they had just crossed. The ground had shifted, collapsing into a small sinkhole. For a moment they stared at the disturbance, hearts pounding. "Let's get back," Jack said, his voice firm. They returned to the lander in silence, the hum from the cavern fading, but not forgotten. Inside, Evelyn was waiting, her face pale and drawn. She pointed to Mark, who was lying on one of the narrow bunks, his arm draped over his eyes. "What happened?" Jack demanded. "He collapsed," Evelyn said. "He said he felt nauseous, then he just went down. I think it's the exposure to those filaments. They've done something to him." Jack turned to Mark, shaking him gently. "Mark, can you hear me?" Mark groaned, his voice weak. "Feels like something's crawling under my skin." Evelyn lifted his sleeve, revealing red, irritated streaks running along his forearm. Beneath the surface, faint, translucent filaments snaked through his flesh, moving slowly, deliberately. "Oh my God," Jake whispered, backing away. Jack's stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Evelyn, what the hell is this?" "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "It's like the filaments are spreading, taking over his tissue. I've never seen anything like it." Mark let out a sharp cry, his body convulsing. The filaments writhed beneath his skin, spreading rapidly. Evelyn scrambled to inject him with a sedative, but it barely seemed to slow the progression. The crew watched in horror as Mark's breathing grew shallow, his eyes rolling back in his head. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the convulsions stopped. Mark lay still, his chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. "What do we do?" Jake asked, his voice cracking. Jack stared at Mark's motionless form, his mind racing. "We find out what's in that cavern," he said grimly, "and we end this." The lander was a mausoleum of fear. The faint hum from the cavern, distant yet insistent, seemed to infiltrate the walls, vibrating in the silence. Jack Sullivan sat by the sealed hatch, his hand resting on the butt of his emergency pistol. Evelyn Harper hovered over Mark Dawson, who lay still but alive, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Jake Turner sat against the far wall, his knees pulled to his chest, his helmet beside him. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Evelyn broke the silence. "His vitals are weakening." Her voice was barely audible. "Whatever this thing is, it's moving through him faster than I anticipated." Jack looked over at her, his face drawn and pale. "Faster how?" Evelyn hesitated, her hands trembling as she adjusted the scanner over Mark's chest. "It's adapting. His cells are being rewritten, replaced by whatever this filament is. It's not just spreading, it's restructuring him." Jake let out a strangled laugh, devoid of humor. "Restructuring? You mean it's turning him into one of those things?" "No," Evelyn snapped, though her tone betrayed doubt. "We don't know what it's turning him into, but it's not too late to stop it. If we can understand it." Jack stood abruptly, cutting her off. "We don't have time to understand anything. If this thing gets out, if it finds a way to Earth, we're not even sure it can leave the moon," Evelyn shot back, her frustration boiling over. "This could be the discovery of a lifetime, an alien life form." "This isn't life," Jack said coldly. "It's death." Mark stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. His body convulsed, his back arching off the cot as his eyes snapped open. They were no longer the warm brown the crew had come to know. They were black, deep, endless voids that reflected the dim light of the cabin. "Mark?" Evelyn whispered, stepping back. He let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a growl, as his limbs twitched and twisted unnaturally. His skin bulged and stretched, the translucent filaments beneath it writhing like living veins. His jaw opened too wide, an unnatural crack echoing through the cabin. Jack pulled his pistol. "Evelyn, move!" "Wait!" Evelyn shouted, holding up her hands. "He's still alive. We can—" Mark's body spasmed violently, his chest splitting open in a spray of blood and viscera. The crew recoiled in horror as something emerged from within him. It unfolded itself in jerky, unnatural movements, its sinewy body glistening with a slick, organic sheen. Long, chitinous limbs extended outward, tipped with razor-sharp talons. Its eyeless head swiveled toward them, its mandibles clicking together in a grotesque, rhythmic pattern. For a moment, no one moved. The creature's breathing was a wet, guttural rasp, its body heaving as it adjusted to its new surroundings. Then it lunged. Jake screamed as it moved faster than their eyes could track, its claws raking across his arm as he scrambled backward. Jack fired, the sharp crack of the pistol deafening in the small space. The bullets struck the creature, but it barely flinched, its exoskeleton deflecting the rounds. It screeched, a piercing, otherworldly sound that reverberated through the cabin, before retreating toward the hatch, moving with a sickening, insect-like grace. "It's getting out!" Jack shouted, fumbling to reload. The creature slammed against the hatch, its claws tearing into the metal. With a final, powerful strike, it breached the seal and disappeared into the void, its form vanishing into the darkness of the lunar surface. Evelyn collapsed to her knees, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "It's loose," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's out there." Jack holstered the pistol, his jaw clenched. "We have to track it. Kill it." "Are you insane?" Jake spat, clutching his bleeding arm. "That thing ripped through Mark like he was nothing. What the hell are we supposed to do against it?" "We don't have a choice," Jack said. "If we leave it out there, it could compromise the lander. If we wait, it'll pick us off one by one. We find it. We stop it." "How?" Evelyn asked, her voice hollow. "Bullets don't work. We don't even know what it is." Jack looked at her, his eyes cold. "We'll figure it out. Get your gear. We're going hunting." The crew suited up in silence, their movements mechanical, their minds numb with fear. Jake clutched the flamethrower, his knuckles white. Evelyn carried a portable scanner, her eyes darting nervously to every shadow. Jack led the way, his steps steady, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they ventured out into the unforgiving lunar terrain. The cavern was their destination. The hum that had haunted them since their arrival was louder now, almost deafening. The air, or what passed for it in their suits, felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. The shadows seemed to shift as they moved, shapes flickering at the edges of their vision. "It's close," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "I'm picking up movement, just ahead." They entered the cavern, their lights illuminating walls, lined with the same shimmering threads that had infected Mark. The threads pulsed faintly, as if alive. And then they saw it. The creature was perched on a ledge, its body hunched and twitching as it fed on something unrecognizable. It turned toward them, its mandibles clicking, its eyeless face somehow locked on theirs. Jack raised his pistol. "Now!" Jake fired the flamethrower, a jet of fire engulfing the creature. It screeched, its body thrashing violently, But instead of retreating, it leapt toward them, flames still clinging to its form. It struck Jake, knocking him to the ground, its talons tearing into his suit. Evelyn screamed as Jack fired again, this time aiming for the exposed joints in its limbs. The creature recoiled, ichor spraying from the wounds, but it didn't stop. It moved with relentless fury, its body contorting and twisting in impossible ways. In the chaos, Evelyn's scanner emitted a sharp beep. Her eyes widened. "Jack, there's more! The whole cavern, it's—" The creature lunged again, cutting her off. Jack tackled her out of the way, firing point blank into its gaping maw. The creature staggered, its movements growing erratic. Finally, with a guttural hiss, it collapsed, its body twitching before going still. The silence was deafening. Jack and Evelyn sat motionless, their breaths ragged, their suits smeared with blood and ichor. Jake's lifeless body lay nearby, his helmet shattered, his face frozen in terror. Evelyn's scanner beeped again, louder this time. She turned it toward the walls, her face pale as the readings spiked. "They're waking up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack followed her gaze. The threads lining the cavern walls were no longer faint. They pulsed with a sickly green light, the hum growing louder, more insistent, and from the shadows more shapes began to move. The cavern was alive. The walls, once cold and jagged, now pulsed with a sickly, greenish glow. The alien threads writhed in synchronized patterns, as if responding to an unspoken command. Shapes shifted in the darkness, hundreds of them. The hum that had haunted them since their arrival grew deafening, resonating deep within their chests. Jack Sullivan stood frozen, his weapon trembling in his hand. Beside him, Evelyn Harper clutched her scanner, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They were never dormant," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "We didn't wake them up. We were invited." "Invited?" Jack hissed. His flashlight swept over the cavern, catching glimpses of the creatures crawling from the walls, their chitinous bodies shimmering with the same iridescent filaments that had killed Mark. Their movements were deliberate, coordinated, as if guided by a shared mind. "They lured us here," Evelyn said, the scanner in her hand emitting a series of sharp, erratic beeps. The signals, the structures, they weren't random. They were a beacon. They wanted us to come. "Why?" Jack demanded, his voice breaking. "What the hell do they want?" Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of horror and understanding. "To spread." The weight of her words sank in, heavy and inescapable. Jack's grip on his pistol tightened. He scanned the cavern, his mind racing. There were too many of them, far more than he had anticipated. They weren't facing a single creature anymore. They were facing a colony, a hive. "We can't fight them," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "Not all of them. We have to stop it here." Jack's eyes darted to the canisters of liquid oxygen and fuel strapped to his suit. He didn't need her to explain. "The Landers' reserves," he said. "If we rig the oxygen tanks and ignite the main fuel supply, we destroy the whole crater," Evelyn finished, her voice hardening. "We kill everything in it, including us." Jack stared at her, his face grim. "If we don't, they'll find a way off this rock. You saw what it did to Mark. Imagine what it could do to Earth." Evelyn nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She didn't argue. She knew he was right. They moved quickly, every step measured and deliberate. Evelyn worked to arm the fuel cells, her hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Jack kept watch, his weapon trained on the advancing creatures. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they circled, their movements almost curious, as if studying their prey. It was worse than an outright assault. The intelligence behind their actions was unmistakable. "They're waiting for something," Evelyn said, her voice strained. Jack didn't respond. He couldn't take his eyes off the largest creature, perched on a ledge above them. It was bigger than the others, its limbs thicker, its mandibles longer. It moved with a deliberate grace, its eyeless face tilted as if it were watching them. Jack felt a cold dread settle in his chest. This one wasn't just another drone. It was the Queen, or something close to it. Evelyn's voice broke through his thoughts. "The charges are set. 30 seconds. Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable behind the visor of his helmet. "Go," he said. "Get to the lander." Her eyes widened. "What? Number we can..." "Evelyn," Jack said, his voice firm. "You're the only one who can tell them what happened here. You're the only one who can warn them. I'll hold them off." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can't. There's no time," Jack barked, his voice cracking. "Go! That's an order." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. She turned and ran, her boots kicking up clouds of lunar dust as she disappeared into the tunnel leading back to the surface. Jack turned his attention back to the creatures. The Queen tilted its head, its mandibles clicking rhythmically. The others began to close in, their movements slow and deliberate. Jack gritted his teeth, his hand tightening on the detonator. "Come on," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Come and get me." The first creature lunged. Jack fired, the shot hitting its exposed joint and sending it crashing to the ground. Another followed, then another. He fought them off with a fury born of desperation, his bullets finding weak points in their armor. But for everyone he killed, 2 more took its place. He glanced at the timer on his suit. 10 seconds. The Queen moved then, leaping down from its perch. It landed with a bone-rattling thud, its massive form blocking his view of the cavern's exit. Jack raised his pistol, but before he could fire, it struck, its claw slashing through his suit and sending him crashing to the ground. He gasped, the air rushing from his lungs as the Queen loomed over him. 5 seconds. With a grunt of effort, Jack reached for the detonator. The Queen's mandibles opened wide, its breath hot and fetid against his faceplate. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the button. The explosion was instant, a deafening roar that obliterated the cavern in a blinding flash of light and fire. The force of it tore through the hive, incinerating the creatures and sending shockwaves rippling through the lunar surface. The darkness was consumed by flame, and then silence. Evelyn stumbled into the lander, her chest heaving as she sealed the hatch. She collapsed into her seat, her helmet fogging as she struggled to breathe. The lander's systems came to life, the engines roaring as it ascended from the surface. Through the porthole, she saw the crater collapse in on itself, a plume of dust and debris rising into the thin lunar atmosphere. She watched until the moon's far side disappeared from view, replaced by the cold, infinite blackness of space. Back in Earth orbit, her debriefing was met with skepticism. The official report listed Apollo 19 as a failure, its crew lost to an accident on the lunar surface. No mention was made of the creatures, the signals, or the hive. Evelyn knew the truth would never be told. As she stared out the window of the recovery shuttle, the Earth glowing blue and serene below, she felt a cold knot of fear in her chest. The creatures hadn't just lured them there. They had learned from them, adapted. And somewhere deep in the lunar surface, Evelyn was certain that something had survived. The stars beyond the window blinked faintly, like eyes watching, waiting.